Hey, it's Steve Riley. Welcome to this special episode of Great Practice, Great Life. And we're going to talk about probably the number one topic that people listen to the show about, which is money. But we're going to talk about money from multi perspectives, completely different ways, because we have on today's episode a financial behavioralist, a coach, an advisor, a podcaster, a thinker who talks to people about how they think and feel about money and how their thoughts and emotions around money actually get in the way of possibly get in the way of success. And that is my new friend, Jacquette Timmons. So welcome to the show.
Oh my goodness, Steve. I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, explain to the audience what exactly you do and how would you kind of explain your profession?
The timing of our conversation could not be more perfect because just a couple of days ago, I had a coaching session with a client. And if you were to look at her numbers on paper, you would say that she exemplified the epitome of financial success. She's an attorney, um, lives here in New York City. And so it's a big deal that she doesn't have a mortgage. She doesn't have any credit card debt and paid off all of her, law school loans. So any one of those things would be a nice check off the box to have, but she has all three of those. And she's contemplating making a transition. And so she came to me with the question of, am I doing enough? And am I doing the right things? And I like to use that as an example because when we often think about success, we focus in on what can be seen, but not what is unseen. And when we think about financial stress in particular, I often say that stress is silent and it is invisible, but its impact at work and at home is not. So someone would look at her situation and say, well, how does she have financial stress? She doesn't have any debt, da, 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 da. And yet she does because she's wondering, do I have enough? Am I doing the right things? That is a degree of stress. You don't have to be, scrambling to get the next bill paid to have financial stress. Um, and so I bring that up because in my work as a financial behaviorist, there are a couple of things that I'm doing. One is getting people to unpack their mindset around money so that they can have a better understanding of the choices that they make, why they make those choices, the choices that they even see as being available to them to make, helping them to understand where their cognitive biases are showing up and not serving them as opposed to perhaps protecting them. And in her case, as with a lot of lawyers, loss aversion is a big thing that's showing up. And then finally, helping folks to see what systems do they have in place and not just in terms of managing the mechanics of money, but how do you go about making decisions when it comes to money? So I look at my work as fundamentally helping people with their relationships with money and getting them to understand that success with it is never just about the numbers, which means we have to focus on the human side of it. So that's where the behavioral piece of it comes into play.
And there's a lot of people that make money and do good are rewarded
Yep.
handsomely for contributing and doing good. So
Yep.
it's a major pivot point in my life. Is that what you're talking about as a financial behavioralist? Like helping crazy people like me deal with crazy thoughts about money?
Absolutely, and it's not only the familial dynamic, but it's also the cultural dynamic, whether it's within your community or large scale cultural, it's societal. Even the whole notion of, I spoke at a conference, I guess now 2 years ago, and I walked people through how I have seen the industry change over the last 4 decades. And even at the height of, the late 80s, early 90s, when you have this movement of more firms, like for example, when I started at Bankers Trust, I had a defined contribution plan. By the time I left 10 years later, it had been converted into a defined contribution plan because that was the wave that a lot of corporations were undergoing in terms of shifting the responsibility of retirement planning from the employer to the employee. Now, mind you, they did this without providing a lot of assistance in terms of, well, how does somebody select a mutual fund or underlying investment? But you have that going on at the same time that you have, a growth in the self-help movement and personal development movement. And you have those things coming together, which on one hand is like, you can do anything. Okay, fantastic. But then also, everything that you do is entirely your fault if it doesn't go well. And that is not exactly right when you're not taking into account some of the systemic and the cultural challenges and barriers that are in place. So it's really unpacking what's the familial dynamic that is coming up, what's the social and the cultural pieces that are coming up, and also what are some of the, personal responsibility elements and how do they all come together to shape your experience?
Why have you dedicated your career, your profession, your writing, your speaking to this? Why is this so important?
Oh my goodness. Um, Part of it is just my own personal experience. I've had my own business since 1995, and initially it started off as an investment advisory firm, and it's now morphed into what it is today, which is a human-centered coaching and speaking business around money. But I started my career at the young age of 20 at Bankers Trust, and I was aware of something before I was aware that there was a word for it. Meaning, I saw the crash up close and personal in 1987, and I saw dramatically different responses to that one event. And it's kind of funny now because, a 500-point drop now is like, whatever. But back then, it was a huge deal. And, I saw folks that if they could have jumped out of a window because of how much money they lost that day for themselves and for their clients, they would have. And I'm not exaggerating. And there were other people that were really calm. And like I said, I'm just 20. It's my first, job on Wall Street right out of undergrad. I don't really understand what is happening, but I just know that what I am seeing doesn't make any sense because these people are freaking out. These people aren't, and they're not talking to one another. And I don't understand why. So that was the first seedling of helping me to understand that there's more to this picture than just the numbers. So that's one. The second is I spent the majority of my decade there in the private bank. And by the time I left, was on a team managing money for high net worth individuals, even started a new practice group, if you want to call it that. And I had a chance to see how, yes, those families had a lot more commas and zeros or zeros and commas behind those zeros than my family did. Like I said, my mother worked for Social Security, so we did fine, but we weren't like those families. And yet, they still had the same questions, the same challenges, the frustrations and desires for their children that my mother had for me. They just had more means with which to work. So it was really an eye-opening experience from the standpoint of understanding that the myth that, oh, rich people don't have challenges is false. And likewise, that people who don't have all of those means don't know how to manage their money. Because let me tell you, my mother was fantastic and managing money and saving and passing down, the whole thing of make sure you save and, don't have consumer debt, all of that stuff. So it comes to me from a personal standpoint with regard to how do we typically define financial success and how do we typically measure um, who has it and who doesn't, and how it can be based on numbers that someone can be financially successful and not have multiple millions of dollars. And someone can have multiple millions of dollars and on paper be financially successful, but not really satisfied. So I share that because my definition of success is that you have what you want on your own terms without harming anybody else. And I elongate it to say that I want people to be successful, profitable, and not broke. I've put a little, some parameters around how I define the successful part. But from the profitable part, it's, that you have more than enough money, more than enough time, more than enough space. And from the not broke part, that yes, you're not broke financially, but you're also not broke creatively or energetically.